So before I begin my talk, I want to tell you why I care so much about this topic, about the Tailor Project. Firstly, as Doris said, my father was a Holocaust survivor, and he was one of the tailors who was allowed to immigrate to Canada through the Tailor Project. And of course, he was allowed to bring his family. So if not for that fact, I might not be speaking to you today from Toronto. Secondly, when I researched my historical novel, 44 Hours or Strike, I became fascinated about the story of garment workers in Canada, particularly in the 1930s and the 1940s. Next slide, please. On May the 1st, 2019, my twin brother Max and I were honored to be part of an event at Holy Blossom Temple here in Toronto. It marked Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was there, along with other municipal and provincial politicians. Here's a photo of Faye Kiefer speaking at the event. She came to Canada through the Tailor Project. Next slide, please. But what moved me the most was hearing several stories from the Tailors or their children, as well as Larry Enkin's passionate honoring of his father, Max Enkin. Now, Max Enkin was the head of the selection committee who went to the displaced persons camps to choose the tailors and the dressmakers. And I'll talk more about Max a little bit later. So at the time, Larry Enkin said, quote, "We're trying in every way possible to build on this legacy and educate and provide knowledge to future generations," end of quote. Well, through Larry's work, along with an organization called Impact, 300 family members were tracked down for this project. A book was published and a documentary was made. So before I really get into the crux of my talk, I want to tell you where we're going. Firstly, I want to give you some historical background about Jewish immigration to Canada before, during, and after World War II. And then I'll zero in on the garment workers scheme, or the Tailor Project, as it was popularly called. Now, the Tailor Project was the immigration scheme that allowed approximately 2,100 European tailors and dressmakers, along with their families, many of them Jewish, to come to Canada after World War II. At the end of my talk, I'll show you a brief video, and there will be time for a Q&A. So let's dig right in. Next slide, please. Until the Tailor Project was presented to official immigrations in Ottawa in 1947, there were two pillars, like twin pillars, entrenched in Canadian immigration policy. And you can see on the screen, they were prejudice and economics. And the prejudice, of course, was against the other. As Harold Troper says in his introduction to the book, The Tailor Project, quote, "It could even be argued that racial and ethnic selectivity trumped economic advantage." So what does that mean? Of course, that prejudice trumped economics. Now, way before 1947, Jews were only reluctantly allowed into Canada because a lot of immigration officials and a lot of real Canadians considered Jews to be on the lowest rung of the immigration ladder. Next slide. Here are a few statistics. In 1891, the Canadian census counted only 6,503 Jews. 10 years later, it had increased threefold. And between 1901 and 1911, the number of Jews in Canada exploded, increasing to over 75,000. But, and there's always a but. Next slide. Most Canadians view Jews with a lot of suspicion. You see, with very few exceptions, most Jewish immigrants didn't really want to work on the farm or work in the mines or the lumber camps. Instead, of course, they gravitated to cities like Toronto, Montreal, or Winnipeg. And even more, a lot of the people in the Canadian mainstream, they started to regard this growing community of Yiddish-speaking foreigners and their children as a blight on the urban landscape and a threat to the national good. That's a quote. So after World War I, immigration officials started to scale down on foreign immigration. There were a lot of economic problems then, and of course, Jews caught the eyes of officials more than any other group. Um, some Jews were accused of stealing jobs from real Canadians, and there were more and more calls for restrictions to immigration. And by the mid-1920s, the laws actually made this possible, and there were more passport and visa barriers to immigration. Next slide, please. So it was even worse for Jews who wanted to immigrate. If you take a look at these these lists, you'll see that the government added even more restrictive measures. First, the government was looking for people who, let's say, fit into the Anglo-Canadian majority. And Jews were included in what was called the non-preferred group. And you can see the list on the left-hand side. And that included Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other countries. And even worse, if you look on the right side of this screen, you'll see a third group, and it was called the Special Permit Group. And Jews were included in that group as well. The term, they were racially suspect. And that included people from Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, and so on. So Jews were almost without exception ineligible to immigrate to Canada after the mid-1920s. Well, you know the result. You know the result would be tragic because through the 1930s, the time of the Great Depression, and World War II, and even into the post-war period, even though people started to realize what the horrors that had happened to the Jews in Europe, still Canadian politicians kept Jews out. Next slide, please. Well, you know about Prime Minister Mackenzie King, and I'm sure you've heard about Charles Blair. He was the government official who was responsible for immigration. They were both determined to close those gates to Canada, especially to Jews. And if you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a quote from a magistrate in 1938. You can read it yourself, but I'll read it quickly. The way stateless Jews from Germany are pouring in from every port of this country is becoming an outrage. I intend to enforce the law to the fullest. And you can see that news article as well, which share the sentiment of a lot of Canadians. Next slide, please. Harold Troper quotes Prime Minister Mackenzie King saying in 1947, and I hate to quote this, but I will, with regard to the selection of immigrants, much has been said about discrimination. I wish to make quite clear that Canada is perfectly within her rights in selecting the persons whom we regard as desirable future citizens. It is not a fundamental human right of any alien to enter Canada. It is a privilege. Well, so the doors to Canada were locked and barred. Next slide. Even after the horrors of Kristallnacht, what was called the Night of Broken Glass on November 9th to 10th, 1938, these Canadian politicians and many Canadians refused to accept Jewish immigration. Next slide. One example which you probably know about is how the passengers of the ship, the St. Louis, were refused entry in the spring of 1939, first to Cuba, then to the United States, and finally to Canada. The passengers had to return to Europe, where many of them were eventually murdered by the Nazis. So that's the background. That's the history. Now let's find out what happened after the war. Next slide. I'm sure you know the numbers of the approximately 9 million Jews in pre-war Europe. Fewer than 3 million survived the war. And still, even after people realized the atrocities and the genocide that the Nazis had committed, there are still a lot of people in Canada who didn't want to open those doors to Jewish survivors. Why not? Why did Canada continue to drag its heels? There are three main reasons. Next slide, please. For one thing, the Canadian government and people were worried about the possibility of an economic depression after the war. These fears overrode any sense of responsibility to European refugees, especially to Jews. When I was doing this research, what was fascinating to me, one of the things, was that the realization that these politicians had grown up and, let's say, entered public life during the Great Depression and during the Second World War. So they were still afraid of another Great Depression happening in Canada. Next slide. The second reason for this hesitation was that the officials in Ottawa were worried that the returning military personnel would have trouble being reabsorbed back into civilian life. And they wanted to make sure that these returning troops wouldn't have any problems being reabsorbed. And the next slide, and of course, the third reason was this lurking hostility toward foreign immigrants, particularly against Eastern Europeans, and most particularly against Jews. Next slide. So the legislation was still in hand, this legislation that had been enacted in the mid to late 1920s. So we know that anti-Semitism was very strong in Canada, especially in the 1930s and into the 40s. Harold Troper writes in his introduction to the Tailor Project, between 1933 and 1945, fewer than 5,000 Jewish refugees were admitted to the country. Canada held the worst record of refugee admittance of any Western nation outside the theater of war. I didn't know that. I wonder if you did. Next slide. So meanwhile, Jews in Canada have been clamoring for years to have their relatives brought over from the DP camps. Here's one poster sponsored by the Canadian Jewish Congress, the CJC, to raise funds to help refugees in the camps and to maybe bring them over. And you'll see the poster is in English and in Yiddish in the bottom. Next slide. And here's another poster. I found this years ago when I went to a paper show where you can get all kinds of stuff made of paper. And of course, this caught my attention. And you'll see on the little baby's tuchus there on his behind or her behind, what is branded there. And this was also an appeal. This was by the United Jewish Appeal, again for funds to help the DP survivors. If you look carefully, look through the window, and I think you'll see something that's quite horrifying. Well, next slide, please. So I wanted to show you this map because it shows you how the DP camps were, let's say, organized, how they were drawn on the map after World War II. And you'll see that there was main zones administered by the Allies. There's the British zone in the top left-hand corner, and you'll see Bergen-Belsen is one of the main camps. Where you see the triangle, that's a major DP camp. Then to the right of it is the Soviet zone. Most refugees didn't want to go there. Underneath is the American zone. And you'll see also those main camps. At the bottom there is Landsberg. That was one of the main Jewish camps, not too far from Munich. And then the rest of the part is divided like in smaller areas. There was a French zone, another British zone, American zone, and a Soviet zone. But most of the Jewish refugees anyway wanted to go to the British American zones. They felt they would be treated better and more fairly there. And remember, a lot of these DP camps were built on the site of former concentration camps like Bergen-Belsen or Dachau. If you heard my talk a while ago with Classi Learning, I went into a lot of details about the DP camps, and I won't do that now, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the geography. So about 1/4 of the DPs in these camps were Jews. Most were from Eastern Europe. And they had survived in various ways, maybe from the concentration camps. Some had been in hiding. Some were fighting in partisan units. They were passing on false papers, or they were refugees, Jewish refugees who had escaped to the Soviet Union and now came back. Next slide, please. So here are the numbers, and I find this astounding. You can see by April 1947, that's actually when I was born, there were about 150,000 Jewish DPs in the American zone in Germany, another 27,000 in Austria, and about 15,000 in the British zone. But that's not all. By the summer of 1947, there were 250,000 Jewish DPs in the camps. So the DPs tried to create a semblance of normal life. They had religious schools, agricultural training, vocational training, but they still had no place to go. They were desperate to leave, but where could they go? And so now I want to tell you about the Tailor Project, the garment workers scheme. Next slide. Now, the officials in the Canadian government, they changed. And C.D. Howe and Hugh Keenley's side were in charge of immigration. They pushed for a change in the Immigration Act in 1947. So the stage was set, a new script was written, and here we go. Next slide. So there were a number of clothing manufacturers along with union and Jewish community leaders, and they launched a campaign to try to convince the government that the garment industry in Canada and the very vitality of the Canadian economy hinged on bringing garment workers from the DP camps to Canada. Well, so it's not surprising. You probably know that the garment industry in Canada in those days, in the 1930s and 40s, was dominated by Jews. Either they were owners, they were workers, union officials, storekeepers, and so on. So sometimes these groups were divided and they were fighting. For example, when the workers would go on strike. But in the end, in this project, they were united. They were desperate to rescue Jews from the DP camps of Europe. In March 1947, they presented a brief to Arthur McNamara, the Deputy Minister of Labor, and they applied for a target of 1,500 workers and their families. This brief assured or reassured the government officials that all the costs would be borne by the Jewish community, the costs of selection, transportation, and settlement. In the end, the employers shared the cost along with the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, or it's called JIAS. Next, please. I want to give you an idea of what the brief said to the government. Now, you probably have heard of Tip Top Tailors. It was one of the biggest clothing manufacturers in Toronto. And this is part of their brief to the Minister of Labor. Quote, "Our experience in the past few years has proven that it is impossible to secure sufficient young people willing to learn tailoring, and the sooner some arrangement to bring tailors from Europe can be instituted, the benefit will accrue not only to our industry, but Canada as well." Now, do you notice that there's nothing here about Jews? That first, the brief was a general kind of brief, but you probably realize that the hidden agenda was to bring Jewish DPs. Next slide. So finally, in October 1947, Cabinet approved it was called an ordering council, and it permitted the admission of 2,000 craftsmen for the clothing industry. And that scheme is called the Garment Workers Scheme or the Tailor Project. Now, I'm saying 2,000. The numbers kind of vary until really the final tally was done. But let's just say 2,000. And one thing I want to point out is that although it was called the Tailor Project, a lot of the other people who came were young single women. A lot were sewing machine operators, and they were dressmakers. And my late Aunt Paula was one of those, and that's why she was allowed to come with our family to Canada. Next, please. So there were 5 men chosen to travel to the DP camps to select the garment workers. Each one has a fascinating biography, and if you get the book, The Tailor Project, you'll find out more about them. But very briefly, so Max Enkin was the leader of the commission, and he was a clothing manufacturer in Hamilton, Ontario. Samuel Herbst was the business manager of the union called the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Samuel Poslins was also a clothing manufacturer in Toronto. Bernard Shane was the treasurer of something called the Jewish Labor Committee. And David Solomon was also a clothing manufacturer. Bernard Shane and David Solomon were in Montreal. So they tried to get the representatives from the main garment manufacturing hubs in Canada, Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg. Next slide, please. Now, this is the part that also interests me a lot. So how did they select the candidates? Well, first, the candidates had to prove they had tailoring skills. And I'll tell you a little more about that later. They had to pass security and health screenings, and they had to be between 18 and 55 years old, single or married, with two or fewer children under the age of 18. So, with a lot of schemes, sometimes are exceptions. And one of the exceptions was my own family, because my father was a master tailor, but there were three of us children in the family. But they let my father and the family come to Canada, and one other tailor with his family with three children come to Canada because they were both master tailors. So I'm here to tell the tale that sometimes to break the rules works okay. So the selection committee had a really tough job. They were trying to choose married men with families, but they also chose single men and women. Next slide, please. So you see this telegram here? It was a very strange telegram because the story takes some twists and turns. So it was August 1947. The selection team was already in London, England, ready to go to the camps. And then C.D. Howe apparently had a change of heart or mind. He sent this telegram was sent to Max Enkin. You can see he was staying at the Savoy Hotel in London, and it was sent from Norman Genser, one of the lawyers for this commission, for this group who are trying to bring the tailors over. I don't know if you can see it clearly, but I'll read it for you just so you can understand the impact it probably had. Quote, government insists tailors chosen racially, half Jewish, half Gentile. Understand this proposal submitted today to Cabinet. Extensive discussion here. Advise acceptance. Inform. Plan proceedings September 1st on this basis. Am heartsick, but we must be realistic. Your responsibility increases. Meeting here Tuesday. Hope to speak to you tonight. Regards, Norman. So when the team set out to choose the tailors and the dressmakers, they didn't. There was no clear guideline about this 50% Jews and 50% non-Jews. But I guess the government got cold feet in the last minute, and they decided they wanted to put some restrictions on Jews. So what else is new? I mean, you probably know that during the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, there were quotas against Jews in law schools, medical schools, hospitals, clubs, and so on. There's no big surprise here, but it was terribly disappointing. And the team decided, well, better to get half a loaf than no loaf at all. They had to go ahead and do the best they could. Next slide. Here's a photo of three of the team members. You can see them standing behind the table. The team members are Samuel Herbst, Max Enkin, and Sam Poslins, and they're interviewing some candidates for the Tailor project. Well, this team had their work really cut out for them. David Solomon later recalled, quote, we were sometimes working from 7 one morning till 5 the following day without sleep, I had by now lost 22 pounds. No wonder, he wrote to his wife, Belle. Oh, for a piece of your roasted brisket with nice brown potatoes and sour pickles. But really, he wasn't complaining. He explained, and I'm quoting, the freezing, waterless, and lightless trains and hotels, the low vitamins content diet, the sickness we suffered are nothing compared to the suffering of the DPs. Well, so this team really had their work cut out for them. The American Joint Distribution Committee, as it was called, the Joint, wanted this team to choose only a few candidates from each DP camp. I mean, Max Ankin said they could have chosen all the candidates, even from one DP camp, but they did want to give hope to the Jewish DPs who were languishing and suffering in the camps. Next slide, please. So at first, the team were schlepping portable sewing machines from DP camp to DP camp, and they had pretty hard tests to fit a sleeve into a garment, to place a lapel in a collar, to make buttonholes. This is by hand, to make buttonholes, and to operate a sewing machine. I love this photo. It's quite rare. And you can see here is my dad. You see the green arrow at the Riedenberg DP camp, and he's sitting with the group of other tailors there, waiting, hoping maybe to go to Canada. So there are different stories about people trying out to be accepted. And some of the people weren't even tailors. You'll see later in the video a great story about someone who managed to slip in. So the team were trying to assess the applicants' abilities really fast. They traveled to 21 camps in 27 days, and they were usually screening 12 to 15 candidates at a time. On some days, they were screening like 200 people. Next, Max Ankin was interviewed after the trip in 1947, and here's what he said. I feel like a public executioner when I think of it. You could pick one man or woman out of every 20 or 30. To that one, you could say, you will have a chance to rebuild your life. The others, you could only send back to their crowded, unheated quarters, to their starvation diet, and to their idleness and despair. Next slide. Well, the team tried their best to work within all the limits that had been set. As I said before, they tried to give priority to men with families, with a wife and 2 children. And you'll see here, a card like this was filled out for each person who was accepted. This is my father's card. You'll see at the top, the last name Dublin, first name Moses. It says where he's going to work, his wife's name, 3 children's name, where we were going to live, who the sponsor was, and you'll see age, married, Polish, and Jewish, and the phone number where they can be reached. So each person coming to Canada had a card like this. And if you go to the Ontario Jewish Archives, you'll see a big file with all these cards. Well, there were lots of glitches along the way, as you can imagine. At first, the Canadian officials, the immigration officials on the ground, didn't allow the Jewish tailors to leave. They said, oh, medical reasons or security reasons. But strangely enough, they allowed the non-Jewish tailors to leave pretty quickly. There were other problems. In those days, making telephone calls was difficult. There was a shortage of typewriters and stenographers to keep track of everything. transportation was overcrowded and it was hard to arrange. Remember, this was still post-war, and a lot of things, the infrastructure had been destroyed. So by the time they were finished, the team had examined more than 5,000 applicants, and in the end, they selected about 3,000 because they thought some of these applicants would be rejected for one reason or another, and they were right. Next slide, please. So I want to show you a couple lists that I dug up when I was doing research. This list is shows the ships that the refugees, the immigrants went on. You'll see at the top, you see the word boats, then Tailors, J stands for Jewish, and J stands for non-Jewish. Thanks, Doris. And then the total. And then also at the top right, you'll see people. Those are the non-Tailors, Jewish, non-Jewish, and total. And you'll see on the side, on the left-hand side, that list shows you the dates of the various ships, starting January 1948, and this one shows down to October 1948. The next list on the next slide, please. I really like this one too. So this shows the ship that my family went on. It was called the SS Samaria. And each person on the ship had this documentation. So again, you'll see my father's name, my mom's name, and the 3 children, and even the phone number where we would be reached in Toronto and the address. Next, please. Well, so this is pretty exciting. Here is a group of people heading to Hamburg and then on the ship to Canada. And if you'll see in the very center of the ship, kneeling down kind of on the floor, that's my mother holding. I'm not sure if she's holding me or my brother, but she's holding one of us. And on the back of that photo, you'll see this information, Zum Andenken, I don't know German, von Salzburg, I guess that's from Salzburg, going to Canada, and you'll see August 1948. Next slide, please. So here is a picture of the actual ship that we came on, coming to Canada, called the Samaria. And Gilda Spitz, whose family also came on the ship, kindly allowed me to use this photo. So some of the ships were pretty good ships. They were passenger ships, like the Samaria, and we arrived in Canada in September 1948. So one time I asked my mom what it was like on the ship. She smiled and said, "They treated us very well." Then she paused. On the ship, it was the first time in 10 years that we had good, regular meals to eat. So other ships were far less comfortable. Some were unconverted troop ships, but still people came. Next slide. And I love this photograph. It's actually the photo that's on the cover of the book, The Tailor Project. This photo is the first batch of the Jewish tailors. They arrived either in Halifax or in Quebec City. And remember that list I showed you a few slides back? So that ship would be like on the top of that list, the first ship. So what happened when they came to Canada? Next slide. Most of these new arrivals went to Toronto or Montreal, and the rest were spread among Winnipeg, Vancouver, and other places. Next slide. I managed to find these old photos of garment factories. Next. And this list, I think, is fascinating because this is what they call the recapitulation, the summary of where all the tailors went, whether they were Jewish or non-Jewish, male or female. Now you'll see the main places are Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. But below that, it says other cities allocated. And you can see all the way, like from Fredericton, Lethbridge, Alberta, Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and so on. Not a lot of the tailors went to the smaller towns and cities, but still, they did go there. Well, next slide. And I love this picture of Udall Nyman on the far left there. And he wasn't a tailor, but he managed to get work as a presser in a Montreal garment factory. It's important to note also that the employers had to guarantee that the workers would get the same wage as their, let's call them regular employees, and they would also get any benefits that the other employees got. Next, please. Of course, there was a problem of housing, and I'm just going to go through this quickly. The various Jewish organizations tried to find housing, and it was pretty hard because after the war, there was a real shortage of housing almost everywhere in Canada. This is a photo of typical house in Toronto downtown, and we ended up living on Huron Street on the third floor in one room. So 6 of us lived on the third floor in one room for a couple years. Next, please. And the Jewish community also tried very hard to help the immigrants. I love this picture. It's quite rare, I think. And if you look in the very middle, you'll see a well-dressed woman wearing a Tailor jacket. And she's holding her right hand, she's holding, that's my mom. And right hand, she's holding me, and left hand, she's holding my twin brother, Max. And we went there for a week in the summer to give these overworked mothers a break. Next, please. And here are photos of another Tailor project family. Chela and Chaim Applebaum were sent to Winnipeg. And here is also a photo of their 2 very successful sons. Next, please. Well, the Tailor Project had far-reaching significance. It was sort of the template to break down barriers of immigration, barriers, racial, and other discrimination practices. It was the model for other schemes. For example, the Vietnamese boat people used that as a model. And I should also mention that shortly after the Tailor Project had its success, there was another, what they call bulk labor scheme to bring Jewish furriers and then Jewish cap and hat makers to Canada. Next, please. And I don't want to end this talk without including mentioning of the Impact Foundation for Social Change. You can read yourself what their mandate is and the good work that they do with refugees now, and I hope to the future. The Impact Foundation was worked very closely with Larry Enkin and his group to create a documentary and a book about the Tailor Project. So just before I show you this video, I want to quote from one of the tailors. His name was Philip Weiss, and here's what he said. "I came here as a tailor. That was the only way I could come to Canada. We didn't have relatives. I didn't have where to go. I lost my youth in Europe, but I think that I came here as a newborn person entirely. It wasn't easy. I had to embrace a new culture, become a different man, think differently, do things differently. But I thank God that I found myself in Canada." So Doris, can you find that video for us?
My father was a tailor, all his brothers were a tailor. I told my father, I don't want to be a tailor. When the war broke out, I had no choice. I knew how to sew and make uniforms, so I wasn't starving. My mother and father, they went somewhere else, they liquidated them. I survived Auschwitz because of my father. I was just lucky, just luck.
A letter from my father, Max Enkin, to my family. What I have seen since I arrived in Europe, particularly since coming to Germany, has shaken me to the core. Internment camps. And yet these people still have the will to survive.
But just imagine, these people are living in a refugee camp. It used to be a concentration camp. They're trying to rebuild their lives, let alone their souls. Somebody comes into that place and says, hey, if you're a tailor, we can bring you to Canada. Can you imagine hearing those words? Canada, getting out of here. I can make a life for myself. This isn't the end of the road. These are people who had no hope. They'd lost everything. The only thing they didn't lose was their lives, but their spirits and their families were gone. They had seen terrible things. And the Tailor Project gave them hope that they could start their lives again. And that's what it did for my parents.
These are the letters from my grandfather. Most of them start the same way, Dear Martin. And actually, he signs them off Papa Dave, which is what we called him. Dear Martin, in late December 1947, I left Southampton for Canada aboard the SS Queen Mary, returning home from Germany and Austria, where I'd been sent by the Canadian government in a team of 5 representatives of management and labor. We were commissioned to examine some 15,000 inmates of Hitler's concentration camps and process 2,500 tailors with their families for immigration into Canada as part of a worldwide movement to empty the DP camps as soon as possible.
My father and the other members of the team went to as many DP camps as possible to give them hope that possibly they could find a way out of those DP camps, finally, into another country.
So I applied. The test was a little nothing. They just want to know if you could hold the needle on the thimble, and if you saw a few, that's it. It was very easy, nothing at all.
My father told his brother, they need tailors in Canada. Let's go, we're gonna sign up. And his brother said, we're not tailors. And my father said, don't matter, let's put our name on a list. He couldn't sew at all. So he paid somebody to write the exam. And it was just the next step towards survival. How do I get out of here? He gave the man his coordinates, how old he was, what his birthday is. His name is Jonas Schlanger. As he said, I was looking in the window, watching the guy. He'd take a cotton and he put it through the needle. Like this, I know, I come to Canada. When he got here, they wanted to assign him to a sweatshop. And he said, but I'm not a tailor. And they said, well, how did you get here? With the ship, just like everybody else.
The boat was terrible. Everybody was sick. Everybody was throwing up. Then I came to Montreal and I started to work in the factory. Well, I'll tell you the truth, I was happy to come to Canada and I was happy to be here. And I met a nice girl. I was making a living, had a nice family. I bought a little duplex, and till I retired, I'm okay. I love you too, bye. When I came to Canada, off the boat, I didn't have anything, not one penny.
When I think about having nothing and coming here with nothing, except for maybe my mother's gold ring and my father's gold ring on their fingers, that they went forward. When he got here, he convinced a bank manager to give him a loan, and he started a fish business. Of course, he knew nothing about fish either, just like he didn't know anything about tailoring. But he walked into a place in Kensington Market and put on an apron and walked behind the counter and told the guy, I need to learn about fish. I'm not leaving. You tell me.
Kensington Market, which is the historic heart of the Jewish community in Toronto. It's where the community built its places of worship, its synagogues. Always thought it's sort of interesting that I landed here, just a few blocks from Kensington Market. And when I look out my windows, I can see the Tailor factories where a lot of this history takes place. It is a very Canadian story about overcoming adversity and building new lives.
I believe all of our experiences become who we are. Of course, my mother and father's experiences in the war impacted on how I see the world. And my art expresses how I see the world. I think the colors are deceptive. I think the sadness of my history is inside me, but I don't express it in sadness. I express it in the joy of color and the celebration of being here.
To the best of our knowledge, there ended up to be 2,000 families that were able to come to Canada. And families that arrived, and many of them had 2 and 3 children. We were astounded to see what levels of education and competence and contribution to Canada they in turn have made to this country. I am extremely proud of my father, as I was anyways, but in this direction, he was a great citizen and he did a great service to the Jewish community and ultimately to Canada.
Well, if it wasn't for the Tailor Project, what would this country be missing? All these hardworking immigrants who started again, and like my parents, who were good citizens and kind people. Where would we be? We wouldn't be here. The bottom line is, where would we be?
Wow, thank you, Anne. Hopefully there are some questions. If you'd like to unmute yourself, just raise your hand. This was so inspiring, and just thank you for sharing this story with us. Okay, hold on. We have a question. Can you comment on your statement that Bergen-Belsen DP camp was on the site of the concentration camps? I think this is incorrect. My parents and I were in the camp before coming to Canada in 1948. Our photographs from that time show us living in what had been accommodation for the German army. It was not part of the infamous camp. The location name was the same, but we did not live in the site of the concentration camp. We were sponsored by my mother's aunt to Vancouver in 1948.
Thank you. That's really perceptive, and I appreciate that question. I didn't mean that the DP camp used the exact same facilities as the concentration camp, but it was on the same, let's say, piece of land, the same site, or very close to it. I mean, it varied. These DP camps were so different. You know, some were old warehouses or stables or soldiers' barracks. So it's very hard to generalize. But thanks, that's a good question.
Right, and she continues to say that her father was part of the Furrier project.
Ah, great, great.
Marjorie says, you showed how the government required a 50-50 split between Jewish and non-Jewish tailors. Would you happen to know if any Jewish tailors managed to slip in as non-Jews?
Oh, that's such a good question too. No, I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. Although one thing you might like to know is that, so first the government said 50-50, but the selection team had a lot of trouble finding non-Jewish tailors and dressmakers. So it ended up more like 60-40, Jewish and non-Jewish, who were selected.
Thank you. Is there an online list of the tailors, or is it in the book? And do they list the tailors that came?
Not that I'm aware of. Now, Impact Corporation might have a list, and you could go to their website and contact Paul Klein, who's the head of Impact. But I mean, somewhere there is the list, but it's not in the book, I'm afraid. I wish it were.
Yes, somewhere there must be in the archives of
Yeah.
it.
For sure.
Please, if anyone wants to ask Anne a question directly, just raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask her the question. I mean, so many things go through my mind when I look at those pictures because I am a child of survivors. My brother was born in Landsberg in Munich. And so lots of questions.
Landsberg was one of the very, let's say, pro-Zionist camps. There were
Well, they went from there to Israel.
yeah.
So they went there. You know, for many people looking at the photos, I often wondered, like they look healthier, like than what I thought they would look. You know, their hair was grown in, they had gained some weight. You know, and my father explained to me that they went around bartering and you know, getting things from Germans. There were Germans there that felt very guilty and they would bring them food and they could do exchanges and get clothes or fabric to make clothes. And when they left, they didn't have very much, maybe like 2 pieces of clothing, but they were able to put themselves together and look nice, you know?
That's right. And also, Doris, that there were 2 main groups of, let's say, Jews in the DP camps. The first group were the survivors from the concentration camps. And they were in pitiful shape, terrible shape.
Yes.
But a little bit later, about a year later, especially after the Kielce pogrom in 1946, a lot of Jews came, and a lot of them had lived in the Soviet Union during the war. So they weren't in as bad a shape as that first group, for sure.
First group that came in, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, oh, we have some more questions in the queue. Hold on just a moment. Let me go. Helen, a shocker to see only Jewish or non-Jewish listed in the immigrants list. Nothing whatever about RC or Christian Orthodox, although a lot of immigrants came from Eastern Europe and the Baltic Europe, escaping the Russians. Also loved seeing the Tip Top Tailor factory in Toronto with the old baseball stadium behind. Drove by that section many, many times.
Yeah.
Thank you, Helen. Ellen is saying, Anne, I learned so much today. You remain a teacher for me. I still have reference books I bought from you when you worked at Holy Blossom. And my maternal grandmother made hats for Eaton's. Her older brother made coats, both in the early 1900s. Wow.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and Ellen is saying she's going to watch the recording again just to, you know, hear what you had to say. And that short film was very moving, like really special. So thank you for finding it and for sharing it with us.
My pleasure. There are some others as well. If you go to YouTube and search Tailor Project or the Garment Workers Scheme, you might find some others that are
Available.
informative and moving too. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for today, and thank you for Jewish Librarian Association, the Canadian chapter, for joining us, and all the best. And thinking tonight is Yom HaShoah, and you know, so we think of those we've lost, and then, and the people we've lost today, and God willing, the hostages remaining will be come home soon.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you, Doris, and thank you to Classi Learning for hosting this program.
Thank you so much. Be well, everyone. Have a good
Yeah.
evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.